We often sing hymns and don't get a chance to actually pay attention to the words. That melody we just sang, Gustav Holst's lovely but complex melody, is hard to sing. So we're focusing on hitting the notes or ignoring them, as the case may be, and we sometimes miss the words. So I want to read the words of the second verse of that hymn because it makes a suitable prayer and kind of grounds us in what I want to talk about today. Then shall the wolf lie, dwell with the lamb, ne'er shall the fierce devour the small. As beasts and cattle calmly graze, a little child shall lead them all. Then enemies shall learn to love. All creatures shall find their true accord. The hope of peace shall be fulfilled, for all the earth shall know the Lord. Our tech ministry group earlier this year proposed that we buy a new electronic outdoor sign. They proposed it to the giving team. I got the permit from City Hall. They requested that we begin fundraising. And it was about a $20,000 bite. And they unfortunately presented this request after a lot of work to the team at the time when we were facing our biggest financial crisis here in a decade. And it seemed a little bit off the message for us to ask you to raise an extra $20,000 when we're also trying to make up that much or more as a shortfall. So we decided to kind of put it on the back burner. And it's still on the back burner, although I might say that it'll be moving to the front burner at some point because we have a year to act upon that permit before we have to go back and refile. But, you know, don't worry. I'll honor the work that they've done. The ministry group was enamored by the possibility of putting all these wonderful pithy puns and interesting sayings on an electronic board out front that would change, you know, as people would drive by. I think that's fine, except that we in the office were mostly concerned about it or in favor of it because it meant that we didn't have to walk outside to change the sign. We could do it with a phone app or with some kind of a gizmo inside. That really appealed to us. If you've been out there changing that in the heat, the cold, the rain, you'll know what I'm talking about. But it's a peculiarity of American churches, American culture, that we like church signs. Here's a couple. I like the second one. I don't know why some people change churches. What difference does it make which one you stay home from? See what I mean? We like that, you know. And the first one, the top one, is I find your lack of faith disturbing, Darth Vader. I know that he's wrote one of the Gospels, the fifth or the sixth one, I'm not sure which. But I like that one too. It seems to me that American churchgoers read messages on church signs with a lot more attention than they listen to the sermons preached from pulpits like this. I don't take it personally, but I take it personally. Certainly with more devotion and intensity. We don't believe in clever signage so much around here. It seems a bit silly. And it's not that I don't appreciate these signs. Obviously, I do. I find them as amusing as the next person. It's not the case that I've not received a lot of pressure either to put sayings on our sign, even our low-tech sign, which requires somebody to go out with letters and stick on the board. I used to have a former member here, not long after we installed that sign, which cost us close to $5,000 almost 25 years ago, so it was not a cheap sign. They used to come by every day and stop and regale me with the sign message he saw on his way to work. Pastor, this is what the sign said today, he would say. And two of them I remember. This one, God does not make mistakes. See, you had to read that one twice, didn't you? Right. And this is the one that I would do. See? That would be me, see? And there was a sign message, I couldn't find it, but it came from Cleveland, and that spoke to me. It said, God has no favorites, but the sign changer does. Go Browns. So, those of you who are fans of Ohio State, commiserate with me today. I get it. Okay, no. Now, my problem with church signs is that what you put on the outside is supposed to reflect how you are on the inside. So when this one goes up, I despair about what people think about what we do here on the inside of a church. It's not exactly an inspiring message, but sadly it's one that can be seen as true. Think of today's message from Matthew as something you might put on a church sign, because frankly, I've seen it on a church sign before. Since chapter 16 of Matthew, we're in 18 now, Jesus has been talking about the church. Last time I was up at this pulpit, I was pounding it with my shoe talking about how Jesus talked about ecclesia, the gathered ones, the church. And he said to Peter, on this rock, this ecclesia, or this rock, Petros, I will build my ecclesia, my church. And a couple of weeks ago, when I said that, we sang a hymn. And it was another one of those hymns like the one you heard earlier today, this complex, beautiful melody, which we get all wrapped around in our head. Built on a rock, the church shall stand. And we don't listen to the words. And there's two reasons for that. One is because the melody is big and bold and beautiful and hard to sing. And second is because there's 5 verses, and Luther's reflectively stopped singing after 3. We don't do 5 verses. So anything beyond 5 verses, forget. So I want to read you the verses. Just listen to them. Not in our temples made with hands, God the Almighty is dwelling. High in the heavens his temple stands, all earthly temples excelling. Yet he who dwells in heaven above deigns to abide with us in love, making our bodies his temple. On Wednesday evening at Celtic Meditation, we sometimes use something called a circling prayer. It's an ancient form of prayer that speaks about God's encircling love and ever present. Here's one such prayer. Nearer are you, O God, than our breath. Closer are you than our hands and our feet. Yet ours are the eyes with which in mystery you look out upon the world. Ours are the voice which in mystery you speak to the world. Nearer are you, O God, than our breath. Or as the hymn puts it, we are God's house of living stones, built for his own habitation. He fills our hearts, his humble thrones, granting us life and salvation. Were 2 or 3 to seek his face, he in their midst would show his grace, blessings upon them bestow. Jesus said that we are God's gathered people, ecclesia, picked, chosen, called out. And as Matthew's been saying since his very first chapter, God made a promise to us in Jesus. He said, Emmanuel, God with us. Matthew's the only one that uses that word. The promise of his presence, which we find in our text today, is sometimes referred to by preachers as the desperation text. Let me explain. I've been in many a worship setting, most of them Lutheran, but there's always lots and lots of empty chairs. And the often spoken sentiment is this: well, after all, Jesus did say, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name. That's not inspiring either, just so as you know. It's a promise, but that's not what this text is about. This text grows from a different conviction. It says that Jesus is indeed present, but he's present for a reason, because there's something about the nature of this gathered life that we have to remember, and namely it is this: this is not perfect. This text comes to us out of the experience of conflict. And in the end of the promise, Jesus says, where 2 or 3 of you are gathered in my name, I am there in the midst of you. It means that Christ is present when God's people gather. Nearer than your breath even, he is there to encircle you, to bind you, to make you holy, to make you his body in the earth. And this text is used and abused, sadly, and the church's history reflects it. We like to talk about ourselves as being over and against something or someone all the time. The world is our enemy. Society, heretics, pagans, you name it. And one of the tools that the church has used in this struggle against out there, over there, those folk, is something we call excommunication. It comes from this text, Matthew chapter 18. We've even written it into our constitutions. It's used as a last resort to enforce uniformity. It's what the Spanish Inquisition used on heretics and Jews who were tortured and burned to force them to confess that Jesus was Lord. And if that doesn't sound odd to you, it should. We've been taught that these folks came over here to enforce religious freedom, the Pilgrims. They came all the way from Old England to New England because of freedom of religion. Unfortunately, the truth is not quite so noble. Because they came here to enforce their own notion of the one true faith. Having themselves been excised for their beliefs, the very first thing they did when they got here was establish a government that worked to excise anyone who did not agree with them. That's how you got the Salem witch trials. That's how the colonies of Rhode Island and Pennsylvania were formed. The Baptists were sent to Rhode Island, and the Quakers were sent to Pennsylvania. The Lutherans came later. We didn't know where to stop. It puts a damper on Thanksgiving when you stop to consider some of these inconvenient truths, but sadly, it's still a case. I mean, despite our admiration, for example, of Pope Francis and our desire for a joint celebration of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, which also sounds a little odd, The Roman Catholic Church will not commune with us. They will not break bread with us around the altar. But that's okay because the Lutherans won't do it with each other. Hell, the Missouri Synod won't even talk to us. It's tough being a Christian. But regardless of how this has all turned out, here's the truth of it. The church is called by Christ to be the gathered community that celebrates and supports, that challenges and resists, that forgives and heals. And when people see the church, it's not our doctrinal unity, it's not our ethical excellence they see, it's the quality of our life together, which is never about the power of numbers or the authority of numbers. Whether it's 2 or 3 or 2 or 3,000, it's about the power of one. The one who gathers it. The power of what happens when we gather in the shade of the divine love, a love that's embodied when a Sunday school teacher gathers her second graders in a circle to tell them about Jesus. Demonstrated when a tutor and a student hash out math and reading problems at GED out here, Monday through Thursday. The love demonstrated when the volunteers come on a Wednesday night to prepare a meal and to feed the hungry. A love demonstrated where 2 or 3 go to a hospital room to place a prayer shawl that's been made by people with their own hands around the shoulders of someone who's critically ill, and then say a prayer with voices that tremble because they know 2 things. Healing's a miracle, and Christ is present. When 2 or 3 are gathered, it's not out of flow charts or infrastructures or processes, because the church is ecclesia, chosen, called, picked out, a gathered people, a bridge from one place to another, a playground for faith and transformation. It is of this reality that Jesus spoke when he talked about excommunication. And let me summarize his words for you differently. People sin. And in this gathered community, we're all sinners. When sin happens, which it will, and if you're involved in it, which you will not be able to avoid, you need to do something about it. Not ignore it, not stick your head in the ground, not pretend it doesn't exist, not involve yourselves in a conspiracy of cordiality, but to name the sin, because that's the first thing you have to do to get to forgiveness. Talk to the person who sinned against you like you're an adult, instead of talking about them behind their back like you're 12 years old. Then, involve the community, because everybody has a stake in whether or not you succeed in reconciliation, especially if there's only 2 or 3 of you. When 2 of you don't agree in a 3-person church, that's a big problem. Because one day, the sinner will be you, and the one sinned against will be them, and the next day, vice versa. And if that fails, take it to the whole community, because Jesus is saying sin is a challenge for the whole community. And being a member of a gathered community means you have a responsibility. If the sheep is lost, you don't look for an hour and call it quits. You go out and find it. If your brother sins against you 77 times, that's the minimum number of times you're called to forgive him, not 76. That's the minimum number of trombones needed in the Music Man. And if that doesn't work, then treat them like a tax collector or a pagan. And remember that the man who wrote these words, Matthew, was a pagan tax collector. So he knows how Jesus treats people. And then note this. It's only then that Jesus talks about the power of agreement, by saying anything you agree upon on earth will be done by your Father in heaven. And he doesn't end there. He says, and remember this, where even 2 or 3 of you are gathering in the name, where 2 or 3 of you are gathered, and I presume that means the 2 or 3 who do not listen to each other, and the one who sinned against you, and the one who sinned against. It means the 2 that can't handle conflict. Even there it says, especially there Jesus says, I'm with you. I'm in the midst of you. I will not leave you alone. It seems to me the subject of this passage could not be a more fitting talk for the Christian community today. Because one of the biggest issues plaguing us today is our inability and our unwillingness to handle conflict and confront sin in the way that Jesus has commanded us. We simply have not learned how to live together. We don't know how to fight together. And when we fight, we don't know how to stay together. Why? Because you're sinners. Are you not paying attention? That's why Jesus needs to be here in our midst. He calls us to be an authentic community, and that's not easy. It's hard work, but it's good work. It's worthy work. It's holy work. Because when we are, in those rare moments when 2 or 3 gather in the name of Christ, and they are the body of Christ in the world sees it. And a little bit of heaven happens right here, in the last place where you'd expect it. Because Jesus is with us. So here's the question. What kind of a community do you want this one to be? This one right here, the one you're sitting in, with Jesus at your side in your midst. Because there's all kinds of communities. There's cyber communities and social media communities and work communities and school communities. There's play groups and running clubs and folks that you eat with at the restaurant or the dining hall or the rehab center. They're all different. They all have a different person. But what kind of purpose do you want this community to have? It can be superficial. Just be here to make you feel good. That's certainly safe. Or it can be something more. It can be riskier. It can be a place that both encourages you and holds you accountable. It can be a place where we can be honest about our hopes and our fears and our dreams and our anxieties. It can be a place where we gather together to make a difference and to be different. Whatever it is most certainly this, a community called together by Jesus Christ, and He is here, always here, in its midst, always. And it matters that we gather. Oh, it really matters. Church is not an option. It's not something you do in a busy week that makes the week even busier. It matters even if it's just 2 or 3 of us, that we gather in the vision of our dreams to do things that are both interesting and useful and joyous. That we gather to make music. That we gather to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with our God. It matters that we modestly and hopefully gather, because when we do, Jesus promises, what we do on earth will be made holy in heaven. This is a promise. This is the hope. This is why it matters. It's the power and the poetry and the point of every gathering, that the one who teaches us, who heals us, who knows us, who loves us, who died for us and lives for us is among us, so that we might be there for the world that He loves, even in 2s or 3s, a reflection of heaven's holiest intentions. Through all the passing years, O Lord, grant that when church bells are ringing, many may come to hear God's word, where He this promise is bringing. I know my own know me. You, not the world, my face will see. My peace I leave with you. Amen. Let us rise together.